Well, as somebody who has spent the last several years in Washington fighting for the reform that Mr. Yates was just talking about, it's really nice to be on a panel and hear someone in government talk about will, not if or when, but how it will work. It's also nice as somebody who spends a lot of time in the legislative process, which, as you all know, is the famous old joke about sausage being made, a place you don't really want to, a process you don't really want to watch on an empty stomach. It's nice to have the opportunity to stand back here and think about really what should our immigration policy be. In a rational world, if we could really design it as it should work rather than those compromises they have to make, what do we really want and need in a bill? And I think what I'd like to do in my 10 minutes is, I think it's hard to think about what a remedy should be unless you start with what the diagnosis is. So I'd like to start with a diagnosis of why I think the immigration system is broken and then go on to my remedy. And really, if I had to sum it up, my basic answer to why it's broken is that the law isn't keeping up with the reality of globalization and of the very interlocked and interrelated world we live in today, and the possibilities for economic dynamism that come with that interrelated and interlocked world. So step back for a minute. Let's think about some of the forces behind the statistical picture that Jeff gave you, the very informative statistical picture that Jeff gave you. The flows are much bigger now than they or have been, when I say now, in the last 30 years, than they were, let's say, in the middle of the 20th century. We tend to think of Ellis Island, and then we kind of forget what happened in the middle of the century, and then we know what's happening today. Well, in the 1960s, there were only a couple of 100,000 people coming a year, whereas now, as Jeff pointed out, there are about 1.5 million coming every year. And that's not an accident, and it's not because a bunch of senators, Senator Kennedy and others, turned on a faucet in 1965. It's because of big demographic and communications shifts, both in the United States and in Latin America. Demographic realities, the few key demographic realities. U.S. fertility is slowing. By 2015, 2020, we're not going to be replacing our population, and that slowing has been happening for years now. Baby boomers are retiring. They're going to retire a little less quickly now, but in the next 5 to 10 years, 75 million baby boomers are going to drop out of the labor force, and that's been happening for a while. Most important, the U.S. population is getting more and more educated. I always say if there's one set of numbers you need to know to understand immigration today, it's that in 1960, half of all American men dropped out of high school and wanted to do unskilled physical work. Half. Today, less than 10% of American men drop out of high school and want to do unskilled physical work. But we still need that kind of work done. Meanwhile, there are all sorts of factors happening in developing countries that are sending people out. I'm not going to go into those. But the point is that communications work really well, too. The guy who's working here in New York in a coffee shop takes out his cell phone and he calls his cousin at home in his little village in Mexico and he says, you know, there's not that much work in the coffee shop. I don't advise you to come this year. And somebody else calls from Las Vegas and says, hey, you know, business is booming in Las Vegas. You ought to come here. And that's the reality, the changing shifts in our demography and this new world of communications that's producing that dynamic picture that you saw, Jeff's slide, that slide that really captured it, that had the employment rate and had the numbers of immigration going right in sync with the employment rate in the U.S. And it's a dynamic market situation that basically has worked for the U.S. and for our economy these past 20, 30 years. It works at the high end. People come to do jobs at the high end because we don't produce enough doctors and engineers and PhD scientists. About 25% of our doctors and nurses because we don't produce enough of them, about 40% of our science PhDs. And it works at the low end because we don't produce farm hands and we don't produce dishwashers and we don't produce temporary seasonal workers. And you know, you hear, and unfortunately Mark Krikorian, our great opponent who's not here, you know, he would say, well, these workers are taking American jobs. The truth is that because they're so different from us, either more or less educated, they don't compete with us. By and large, they complement us. And so, you know, think about a restaurant. You start a restaurant because you have the available dishwashers and busboys, well, that allows you to hire a chef and hire a maitre d' and hire an architect. Complementary work. Immigrants complement us, and because they complement us, they help grow the economy. They help sustain jobs for Americans, not just that chef and that maitre d', but also the people who are growing the food and the guys who are insuring the restaurant and designing the restaurant and financing the restaurant. And they make us all more productive because of the way they complement us. And that's true even in a recession. I mean, people are, why are we even talking about this in a recession? Americans are still not wanting to do those jobs at the low end, and we're still not graduating enough people to do all the jobs that we're going to need, especially when the recovery starts at the high end. The New York Times did a great piece a few weeks ago where the reporter spent some time in a meatpacking plant in Tennessee, a town built around a meatpacking plant. And the emblematic guy she chose, the white guy who'd been working as a mechanic, earning $15 an hour, he'd been out of work for 6 months. He'd lost his truck, he'd lost his house, he'd gone home to live with his mother, but he still wasn't interested in going and doing that hard physical work on the line of cutting off the chickens' heads that immigrants are willing to do. And so we're still needing immigrants in a recession. We're going to need them even more when the economy picks up and we start to want to grow the economy again. Hard to grow a business without workers, hard to grow an economy without workers. So the problem isn't really the immigrants, and I'm coming back to my diagnosis. The problem is the law that's fighting the dynamism of the world economy. About 1.5 million people come every year, pulled by supply and demand. As you heard from Jeff, we give out about 1 million, 1.1 million visas. It's as if we were making cars here and had to import the steel, but our steel quotas were 1/3 too low. I mean, how dumb would that be? And of course, it's bad for everyone. It's bad for the immigrants who have to die in the desert to get here. It's bad for American workers who are undercut when these workers are, because they're illegal, can't really bargain for their rights. It's bad for the rule of law, obviously. It's bad for border security. I'll never forget the border guard who said to me, if another 9/11 happens and it happens on my watch because I'm chasing your next busboy or my next gardener, I'll never forgive myself. And it's bad for employers who have to make a choice. Do I grow my business or do I obey the law? The only people who benefit are the smugglers. So that's the diagnosis. What's the remedy? Well, first I'll talk a little bit about my ideal remedy, and then I'll talk briefly about the constraints that politics this year are putting on an ideal remedy. The ideal remedy has 3 pillars. The first and most important pillar is better enforcement. We've had a situation for the last 20, 30, 40 years, where, as another Border Patrol guard once said to me, we make the law to keep one side happy and we don't enforce it to keep the other side happy. Well, we need realistic law, and we need to start